I'm standing on the north shore of Lake Ontario at a place called Adolphustown, which is the landing site of the very first United Empire Loyalists that arrive after the British have been defeated by the American colonists in the American Revolution. What was the war like for them? A number of terms have been used. It was a world on fire, it was a world turned upside down. But one of the best quotes that I found was the daughter of one of the Loyalists who made a statement that nothing remains but burning ashes. And I found that a very moving statement for people that totally were uprooted and made their way to what at that time was total wilderness and starting a whole new beginning. I'm going to be taking a walk up to the cemetery, and it's an interesting thing because shortly after the very first boat lands on this shore, a young infant dies, and they form and prepare a site for a cemetery, which would have been the first cemetery in what would soon become Upper Canada when the province of Quebec is divided into Lower Canada and Upper Canada. So I'm going to take a wander up to the cemetery, and we'll chat a bit about the history of the United Empire Loyalists. There's a common misconception that at the outbreak of the American Revolution that the majority of the population of the American colonies supported revolution and separation from England, and that's simply not the case. We have approximately a third of the population that are strong proponents of it. Approximately a third want to remain loyal to the king, and another third are just fence sitters. They're going to sort of weigh their time and see which side of the fence they should jump off on. At the end of it, 60,000 loyalists are expelled from the country, often under violence. They're not given any civil rights, and they make their way to these shores. The bulk of them to the east coast, Nova Scotia. They form the province of New Brunswick, as well as Cape Breton. A few to what would become Upper Canada, or Lower Canada, Quebec, and then quite a few would land here on this very shore. And this province was then made of Upper Canada. So the question comes to mind is, well, why did they remain loyal to the king? There's a number of reasons. First and foremost, some just felt that was their duty. It was the mother country. Some felt that if the American revolutionaries were successful, that the American colonies would disintegrate into chaos. And although the majority of American colonists at the time totally believed that they were being mistreated by England, the third that remained loyal to the king felt that they could still, through diplomatic means, resolve their issues, such as tax and other things. Anyway, onwards to the cemetery. So I mentioned that the Loyalists were not given any civil rights, and that's to put it mildly. So before I get into what it was truly like to be a United Empire Loyalist, I could dispel a few myths. And one of them is we often see the Loyalists arriving in British-controlled areas like Canada. They're affluent, they're rich, and that's anything but the case. Of the 60,000 United Empire Loyalists that arrive on these shores, the bulk of them are tradesmen or farming backgrounds. In addition to that, we have about 15,000 Afro-American enslaved people that are also going to arrive in the Canadas. There's a letter written by the Governor Haldeman at the time, perhaps not verbatim, but essentially says, the familiar who call themselves Loyalists continue to come in large parties, both starving and naked. So that's what it was like to be a Loyalist. And as I mentioned, they're not just coming to land grants. They've lived in refugee camps for upwards of 8 years. An example, well, we have a couple in large ones in Quebec, what we know as Quebec today, but New York City was taken by the British at the start of the war and continues to be in British hands until the end. Now, the population of New York City, it increases sevenfold. There's an account by an Afro-American enslaved man who had made his way into the refuge of New York City, and he says, we can barely keep clothes on our back. So there was huge unemployment, there was a lack of food, there was sickness, disease. That's what life was like for these loyalists for upwards of an 8-year period. So who was labeled a loyalist? There are a number of factors at play here. And obviously it's the politics. So we think immediately if one declared that they were against separation from England, that would label you as a loyalist. But there were a lot of other factors. There were boycotted goods when the war begins. If you were in the trade of buying or selling those goods, you were labeled a loyalist. You could even have one of those boycotted goods in your house that you purchased prior to the American Revolution. You were labeled a loyalist. If you at any time traveled to British-controlled territory, you were labeled a loyalist. Often it was by association. So women had virtually no rights at the time. They couldn't own land. So if the man of the house was labeled a loyalist, by association, so was his family, so were his indentured servants or slaves. So in 1770, the Continental Congress passed legislation that forms the Committee of Safety. The intent of forming this committee was that they would act as a police force, essentially. However, we find out that more often than not, they just turn into a vigilante group, mob-oriented, and often are determining with little or no evidence who is or isn't a loyalist. To dispel a myth about tar and feathering, because that was a common torture that was used on people that they felt were loyalists. And modern television or movies would indicate that people recovered from it, and that simply isn't the case. If you were fully tarred and feathered, in other words, your entire body, you would live between 3 and 5 days. No one survived that. Occasionally, if a limb was tarred and feathered, you would survive that, but you'd probably lose use of that particular limb. We fast forward now a couple of years, 1777, I believe, they formed the next committee, which is the Committee of Correspondence. I try to put this in modern reference, if you would. If I think about somebody reading all my correspondence, so this group read everything that came in and out by mail. Every single document, every single letter, every single birthday wish was read by the Committee of Correspondence. And often that would lead to somebody being labeled a loyalist. And often they weren't. There's an example of a tavern owner who was a profound patriot, opened up his tavern as a meeting place for people. However, his son wrote him a letter who had signed up to fight for the British. And in that simple document, he was labeled a loyalist. And finally, we have what's my all-time favorite, is they form a committee. Actually, it's called the Commission of Defending and Defeating the Conspiracists. And I think they're trying to make it seem like there's some civil law at work here, because they essentially are a judicial system where they are going to try suspected loyalists, and at the end of the day, the gavel will be rung and they will determine whether or not you're labeled the loyalist and what will be the outcome. And in often cases, it was tar and feathering. So we have one final committee, and it's formed in 1777, and it's called the Committee to Seize and Sell Properties. So again, back to what the Loyalists had at the end of an 8-year conflict was absolutely nothing. When they arrived on these shores, they were in abject poverty. And not only that, but they're moving from what was a developed country, huge population relative to Canada, and its wilderness. They're starting again with, forests with trees like this. There is no farmland. There is nothing there. They're starting as if we went back to the 1600s and the Mayflower and Jamestown, for example. So that's basically what our Loyalists were subject to. during that time period. I'm not being judgmental, and I mean no disrespect to my American friends, because I have lots of them. And perhaps in a revolutionary situation like we had in the 1770s, it would take acts like that in order to make it happen. After all, this group of colonists had taken on the largest military might in the world, and at the end of those 8 years of bloody conflict, they won. So this brings me to sort of my final thought on the refugees coming into Canada. And I'm going to talk about the 15,000, approximately 15,000 enslaved black Americans. In 1775, John Murray, who at that time, he's the then governor of the state of Virginia, and he writes a proclamation that frees any slave that fights for the British Army. But the sad irony, and it is sad indeed, at least I find it so, he offers that freedom to slaves if they're owned by patriots. But he doesn't offer the same deal to slaves that are owned by loyalists. I find that absolutely bizarre. So what we have, to kind of sum up, I'm going to soon be at the cemetery, we have this huge influx of people into Canada. And you got to remember, Canada after the French and Indian Wars, the king in his benevolence says you can keep your religion, you can keep your language. And that's why to this very day, our country, my country, Canada, is bilingual. Kind of like it. It makes for a lot of interesting conversation, if nothing else. But we have, for the first time, this huge influx of Anglo and English-speaking peoples, both on the east side and the west side of what we know today as Quebec, which forms eventually the province of Ontario, the provinces of New Brunswick. They add Cape Breton to Nova Scotia. And it totally alters Canada as we knew it at the time. And these refugees are a hodgepodge of every nationality on the planet, every religion, some freed slaves, some not freed slaves, although Canada's soon going to abolish slavery for long, long before the Americas did, because it was abolished in Britain. And that lends itself, I'm going to speak it a little bit further, maybe when I get to the cemetery about it, but about the multiculturalism of the country we call Canada. It's rather interesting that 240 years ago tomorrow will be the landing at these very shores, and the cemetery where this young infant is buried in. It's worth noting too, as well as the United Empire Loyalists, we also have the Haudenosaunee, or the Mohawk of the Iroquois Nation, who were loyal to the king, and they're expelled. And they're in rags, basically old men, women, and children. Most of the warriors are dead or wounded. And they make their way to a landing spot not too far to the west from here. And the King of England deeds them a land grant along the Grand River to Joseph Brant, and the town of Brantford is named after the man. His native name was Tyontonaga. So it's interesting in terms of, if one thinks about what did the Loyalists bring to us when they were forced in these huge numbers, they bring us I guess a culture that makes us unique from Americans in a number of ways. They brought a sense of conservatism. They brought a sense that from a government point of view, we were more prepared to look at evolution versus revolution. And I think in a lot of senses, they make Canada this multicultural country that we now enjoy, and I'm proud to be part of. I have a special guest here. I'd like to introduce Erins Hatton. Erin, pleasure to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
And not only is Erin an avid historian, you've done interpretation, a seamstress, and a published author. And what fascinates me about Anne, we had a chat over breakfast this morning, and Anne knows so much about her family history that makes me so envious, because most of us can't remember back 2 generations, but Anne is going to go a lot, Erin is going to go a lot further back than that, and perhaps you can elaborate a little bit, Erin.
Yes, absolutely. So as we were chatting about this morning, I have United Empire Loyalist ancestors. So my ancestor's name was Josiah Cass, and he served with the British during the Revolution. He was part of the surrender and the parole after Saratoga, so he wasn't permitted to fight in the rest of the conflict. So he had permission to gather his family. He had 6 children and his wife, and they fled to Quebec, to the refugee camp that was just being formed at Machiche. And one thing I find with the Loyalists, talking about the Loyalists, is there's often this sense of the Loyalists leaving their homes and coming straight to their land grants, but that wasn't the case. A lot of people don't know that they were in camps, in refugee camps, for upwards of 6 years.
We think today of refugee camps in our modern world, in foreign countries, but it happened right here on this continent.
It did. Our country was built on refugees, absolutely. So my ancestor Josiah and his wife and 6 children ended up in the camp. Josiah was asked to be the schoolmaster of the camp. And I think there was this sense that, the war would blow over quickly and they would get to return to their homes. And so I guess as the war went on, they found that they were there for a really long time. And they built barracks-style buildings. From the research I've done, they were able to house many, many people in these barracks. There was disease. My ancestor's wife, Mercy, she died there. And while at the camp, one of the most interesting stories I find, my ancestor Josiah met this young woman named Anne, and she has a fascinating story.
Please share.
Yes. So Anne was from Scotland, and her history was really mixed because she was the granddaughter of a laird on the Isle of Skye. And this may be apocryphal. This is what was handed down by her descendants. Right. Her mother, as the daughter of the laird, she was a bit rebellious. She would sneak out of the castle at night, and or maybe during the daytime too, I don't know. She met a young shipwright in the village and fell in love. Her parents disowned her, but her daughter, Anne, then found her way back to the castle, and her grandparents educated her, taught her how to act like a lady. So she was of these 2 worlds. She was raised in this little fishing village, but she was also educated and raised to be a lady. Well, her mother died along the way, and her father decided to start a business in Canada as a shipwright. And so she went with him at the age of 16.
Wow.
And on the way over, he died, and his business partner took all his money. So Anne landed in Canada at the age of 16 with nothing. Penniless. But she was resourceful, and she had an education, so she was able to become a governess. And we know from history that she married a young lieutenant. Well, I guess he was probably older than her. He was a veteran of the French and Indian War. And then they were settling in. They had 2 children. Things looked good for Anne. And then the revolution broke out.
Darn.
And then, so her husband went off to war. And
let me guess, he's killed.
Yes. Yeah. So he died. She was left with these 2 young children, one an infant, and she had to go to the camp at Machiche as well. We know from history as well that her youngest died in the camp, her baby, because the records show that she went in with 2 children and came out with 1. But during the time in the camp, she met my ancestor Josiah Cass, and they got married.
3rd time.
Yeah. And so she was able to make a life for herself with him. They had 6 more children. And after the war, they initially settled in Gaspé, and then they decided they didn't like that for some reason and moved to Hawkesbury area. But it's just such an interesting story when you get to know the people, and you get to know a little bit more of their motives and what they experienced. It really brings it to life.
It sure does. It sure does. And that's the envious part for me. I can follow my ancestors back about 3 generations, and then it's that history is lost.
Yeah.
But maybe you could elaborate a bit on the book you wrote.
Yes. Well, and you mentioned about history being lost. My grandfather really, he kept everything. He kept meticulous records. But more than that, the stories. And that was what I built my first book on, my grandfather's family from Scotland. And the book is about several generations. So going back to the 1600s, when it was illegal to be Presbyterian in Scotland,
Right.
one of my ancestors was a Presbyterian minister, and his convictions were strong enough that he didn't want to
Hide it.
He didn't want to hide it. He didn't want to compromise. So he was doing church services in fields and forests, and he was eventually arrested and put in prison on the Bass Rock in Scotland. And we have some surviving excerpts of his journals that I was able to use.
Wow.
And then going down, 100 years or so, a little more than 100 years, my 4 times great-grandfather was a minister in Scotland as well. And his entire congregation was evicted from their land during the Highland clearances. And so he had no more flock to shepherd. So he followed them here to Canada in Glengarry County, and founded a church there, and also farmed his own land grant. And then the third generation that I write about in the book was my 3 times great aunt, who was a missionary in China. She was a nurse as well.
You have a very eclectic history.
Yes, yeah, and I also have letters and journals that she had written, like all those 3 generations. So just really neat to draw on their experiences, their struggles, their inspirations as well.
And the name of the book?
The name of the book is Across the Deep.
Across the Deep. And what was the impetus behind calling it that?
I really played with generations and how we can be inspired by the generations that go before us. And so the idea of that inspiration going across the generations, but also the metaphor of the deep, the sea. There's ocean crossings in the book, and across time, from one generation to the next. And I also pulled that from like a Bible verse that talks about deep calling to deep, and just such poetic
Biblical
language.
as well.
Yeah.
One can get sort out their genealogy. You can do all that stuff, but as you mentioned, it's the stories that bring history to life, right? Yeah, it's fascinating. Yours is a fascinating one, and you're a fascinating person, and I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Erin.
So here we are on board Lorraine, a 27-foot Montague whaler that's been modified to look more historic. We've had a lot of fun with these boats over the years. Probably the most remarkable one was going down the St. Lawrence River, starting in Bath and winding up at the Battle of Chrysler's Farm for the reenactment as part of the War of 1812 bicentennial. It's a great experience because it was real history in real time. We would sail a day's journey and then come ashore every night and pitch tents and eat and camp, and then the next day we'd break down and carry on, duplicating mulcasters. achievements in 1813. I know I enjoyed it a great deal, where we really felt we were touching on what those great men did way back when.